In 1931, there was an uprising among farmers here in eastern Alabama, which resulted in the sheriff, J. Kyle Young, killing the union's organizer, a black man named Ralph Gray. Now, because the Sharecroppers Union was broadly affiliated with Communist Party USA, I'll go to detail more about the political machinations in a later video, the sheriff began cracking down on the union. Now, this union immediately began seeing dwindling membership numbers, and that's because the union from the very beginning had a totally wide range of support. Everybody in the county was a member because they didn't collect dues, and joining it did not risk anything to your person. However, after Ralph Gray had been killed by the sheriff and his posse, they decided to, most people, leave the union. However, the men who stuck with the union began to turn it into a more mainstream union, began to collect dues, and were under the leadership of a man named Ned Cobb, who is a personal hero of mine and who should be a hero of working people everywhere. Now, Ned Cobb was the son of a man who had been enslaved during the Civil War, and because his father had all of those issues that came with that, mental issues, he would regularly beat his wife and children. Ned Cobb decided to leave home and at 19 began working as a tenant farmer and immediately saw how brutal people were being treated in this profession. It was conditions of near slavery. He joined the Sharecroppers Union, and in 1931, he was a part of the violence that came after the assassination of Ralph Gray. He said that posse men were roving the countrysides in the backs of trucks and shooting into random black-owned cabins. So he came to be the leader of the Sharecroppers Union in the aftermath and began to push a couple of issues. And they couldn't really touch him because he owned his own farm, he was a hard worker, and they couldn't go after him. So they went after one of his friends, who was still a tenant farmer, and they went into his tenant house, and the sheriff found a couple of membership blanks for the Sharecroppers Union. This wasn't illegal. However, he filed a lien on the guy's house, and around this time, the sheriff and a couple of brutal-looking deputies came with guns at the ready to confiscate the man's donkeys. Ned Cobb and a couple of other people came along, members of the Sharecroppers Union, and Ned Cobb was wearing a conspicuously long overcoat to what would become the shootout that resulted in a decade in prison for him. He tried talking calmly with the sheriff. He said, "This doesn't need to happen. If you go back to town, we'll pay you whatever you say he owes. Leave him and leave his donkeys alone." He turns around to walk into his friend's cabin and try to talk to him to see how the situation could be de-escalated, and the sheriff shoots Ned Cobb in the back. He takes 3 shots, doesn't die, but as the posse begins to open fire on the cabin of his friends, this is again not the Wild West, this is 1932, both men are horribly wounded. The man who owns the cabin actually runs down to the Tuskegee Institute. He makes it all the way down there, and he tries to seek some help because it's a black hospital, but they are intimidated into turning him back over to the sheriff. And these 2 men are in prison. And the sheriff, of course, does not allow them to seek medical help, and they both die of their wounds. Miraculously, Ned Cobb survives, and even though they let him languish in prison, in the local county jail rather, he survives. They bring him in front of a rabidly racist judge and sentence him to 12 years in the state penitentiary, just to basically send a message. That was the maximum sentence they could get for somebody in his position. And they offered him parole early, but he refused many times over. They said, if you sell your farm, if you swear away from union organizing, we'll let you out early. And he said no. And he was a man who always stuck by his principles. Even though he converted to Christianity and was baptized in the local river midway between his jail sentence, his prison sentence, he still said, "I stood up for the rights of working men, and I stood up for the rights of sharecroppers. I am still in the right. What I did was right." And he was a man who stood by what he believed in, and he stood up and fought for his convictions, and for that, he is a true Southern hero. The shootout happened in the Cliff James home, and present for that shootout were Sheriff Elder, Ned Cobb, Milo Bentley, and Cliff James himself. Now this is the Bentley grave plot, and you can see here Birdie Bentley buried, who was born around the same time as Ned Cobb, so I can see this being the wife of Milo Bentley, although there is no marker for Milo here, and Cliff James doesn't have a grave marker as far as I can tell. And those 2 men were badly wounded, and unlike Ned Cobb, they both succumbed to their injuries in jail and are buried right alongside Ned Cobb. He's buried a little ways over here. In 1975, Wade Hall, a journalist for a local Kentucky newspaper, arrived to Reeltown, Alabama, looking for members of Ned Cobb's family to interview about what had happened all the way back in 1932. And he found Ned Cobb's first cousin, Oscar Moss, who was the deacon of this church. And naturally, Oscar Moss was a little apprehensive because all most people knew about Ned Cobb was that he was a communist or a communist supporter. So the deacon calmly explained to this journalist that while Ned Cobb was unrepentant for what he had done at that shootout and still believed that he had stood up for the rights of his friends and the rights of people who were being evicted from their properties and basically just having their things stolen by unsympathetic law enforcement, he was a Christian. And Ned Cobb is buried right here. And in this journal entry, in this newspaper article, it says that Oscar Moss lived in this little cinder block house out behind the church. And I think it's fascinating to see this was the home of Ned Cobb's cousin. And even after getting out of jail in 1945, Ned Cobb continued to run his farm. They tried running him out to Mobile or to Birmingham, but he refused, and he stayed in the local area in spite of everybody who could possibly hold a grudge against him. And it's interesting to think that the deacon lived out of this house, and the church has been renovated. And in the article it says it was a cinder block house out to the back of the church, so it might be the one I just showed you, or it might actually be this one. And you need to understand how that union came into being because it was no ordinary union. Now, in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia installed a communist government, and 2 years later they created Comintern. Comintern, according to the Communist Party USA, wasn't just an organ of the Soviet Union. Rather, the Soviet Union was the only communist country, and Comintern, or Communist International, was to welcome representatives of communist parties of other nations. You had Irishmen, you had Finnish people, Polish people, Germans there, all organizing and seeing what was to be done to usher in a communist era or a dictatorship of the proletariat in their respective countries. Now, because of this, Communist Party USA representatives were invited over, and even though there were about 12,000 card-carrying members in the US in the early 1930s, late 1920s, only about 50 of them were black. And they kept raising the issue at the Comintern headquarters because black people, they figured, were the most oppressed group of workers within America. So far, the Communist Party USA and Comintern had sent funds to groups like the Harlan County miners and the people in West Virginia to help organize and unionize. However, nothing had really been done about black workers. So in 1928, they revised their statement on what they called the Negro question. And they wanted at that point in time to advocate for a separate black or Negro Soviet Republic in the Black Belt of America, and so the CPUSA began to focus their efforts and attention on the Black Belt of the US. James S. Allen moved into the district headquarters in Birmingham, Alabama, because Birmingham was unique. Birmingham was industrializing in an area of a state that had usually, up until recent history, simply been cotton, agriculture, and rural farmland. Now they had discovered mines and factories were being built, and it was rapidly industrializing, and naturally they were using mainly poor black labor and labor from people who used to be tenant farmers but had to move out because of the dropping price of cotton. And because of this, there was a man who moved into the local area, Mack Codes. Now, Matt Codes had been a Communist Party USA representative for a while up in Chattanooga, and he was arrested at the Union Hall downtown organizing an election rally because he was to be elected the following day as a judge. He was on the ballot, he was running for public office, and naturally the police raid the meeting at the Union Hall. They arrest him and a number of other people, and the judge who was running against him, naturally he only gets 100 votes. The judge running against him is the judge presiding over his trial. And this judge says, Mac Codes, if you swear off of communism and you swear off of organizing and get yourself a regular job, we'll let you go and you'll be out on parole. Mac Codes says, okay, because to say no meant going on a chain gang and very likely being murdered, because when you entered a chain gang, oftentimes you didn't leave, especially if you were considered expendable by being a black communist. So he said yes. And this was at the same time that CPUSA in Birmingham was receiving reports of widespread starvation. At this time, the credit stores of the local area, or the stores of the local area, were not giving out credit to blacks. And then it reached a point where they weren't giving out store credit to whites, and people were starving to death as their wages dropped, and the landowners had even said that they were going to bring in farm labor at a rate of about $1 a week, although everybody was being charged and was in debt to their landlords to the point where they had to work basically for free and they couldn't leave. And so Mac Codes makes his way from Chattanooga, violating parole, all the way down here. And in 1931, roughly 80 men were in an abandoned building which they were using as a combination church sharecroppers union building. And they were meeting. One of them had a rifle. There were a couple of copies of the Southern Worker, which was the mouthpiece for Communist Party USA District 17 based out of Birmingham. The sheriff raided it. And they found basically, that's all they found. One guy had a rifle, and there were a couple of copies of a communist magazine. And the sheriff left after arresting a few people, but the media began to spread stories of a heavily armed standoff and men in the woods, communists, black communists, trying to start an independent republic and shooting white people. So the sheriff again moves back in to arrest anybody that might have harbored Mac Codes, this communist who was from out of town. And he moves into a local family's cabin and begins beating a woman to the point where he fractured her skull after already beating both of her children simply because he heard Mac Codes was in the local area. And in walks Ralph Gray and holds a pistol up to Sheriff J. Kyle Young. And he says, "You get out of here, and you take your men with you." So Sheriff Young does just that. He goes back to Dadeville in the county, which is predominantly white, and he organizes a posse, and they just rampage through Camp Hill, which is a predominantly black community, shooting into the windows of black cabins. And all of this has been related by James Allen in his memoirs of organizing in the Depression-era South. And at this point in time, the sheriff was unfortunate enough to see Ralph Gray just walking on the side of the road. He sprays a machine gun into his legs and drives off, leaving him there. Members of his family and friends came and brought him to a cabin, and in comes the posse and the sheriff to go, and they don't know what exactly happened. Some people say the cabin was lit on fire and he died because he was under a blanket. Some people say he surrendered without issue and the sheriff turned him over to landlords who lynched him. In any case, they dumped his body on the courthouse steps and a low-level insurgency followed. Ned Cobb actually participated in this, and he guarded his farm because he was a well-known member of the Union with a rifle for several days. Now, time went on, and the Sharecroppers Union began to become more secretive. Because many white members of the Sharecroppers Union had joined the posse, they figured it would be best to eject them from the union and make Ned Cobb the president of that union. But at the same time, a lot of white members still wanted to join in, and the fact that this revolt of 1932 actually had a lot of white sympathy has to do with the fact that people actually were working right alongside with the blacks. And I've met people in the local community who are 86 years old and told me they were too young to remember, they didn't have any experience directly in it, but from everything they remember as a child, the poor white farmers of the community were on pretty even footing with the poor black farmers, and naturally there was segregation, but they all palled around and they played together. So this community had blacks and whites living right alongside each other, and the massacre of 1931 really began with the killing of somebody on basically the terms of the sheriff trying to look for this guy, Mac Codes. At his trial, Ned Cobb's lawyers were provided by the International Labor Defense based out of Chattanooga. They were broadly communist aligned and were given money by the Communist Party USA and by the Comintern based out of the Soviet Union. Now, the judge, Cotton Tom, who's buried here behind me, is the perfect caricature of a Southern Democrat, somebody who sought only to keep blacks in their place. In his earlier career in state politics, he managed to successfully exclude blacks from all voting in the state of Alabama, and in 1903, as a judge, defended white men accused of slavery. Now, in this system, they had police working on their side who would rove the countryside, arresting black men who looked strong enough to work in the Convict leasing program, and simply charge them with anything, and they would now be stuck in slavery. They would be picking cotton, they would be working the mines, and they were totally at the mercy of the prisons. And he said, not that this wasn't slavery, but this is what was needed to keep blacks in their place. Cotton Tom is the man who did that, and he was presiding over Ned Cobb's case, so everybody knew exactly what would happen. Now, shockingly, Ned Cobb was not sentenced to death. He was simply in prison for 12 years. And of course, Cotton Tom said, what is at stake is not the lives of these black men who were shot in the raid on the barn. What is at risk is all of Western civilization. The International Labor Defense and Communist Party USA would argue that Cotton Tom's politics can be best exemplified by his 1903 decision to defend slavery as it was still practiced in Alabama at the time through the Convict leasing program. And basically, in a capitalist system, so the communists would say, the bosses and the factory owners were highly incentivized to sap whatever profit they could, be that by hiring employees who could be paid less or by increasing productivity and not raising wages. Of course, Cotton Tom, being in a position of institutional power, could make it so that people would have to work for free. And in the ideal, unregulated capitalist system, communists would argue that not paying employees at all, or slavery, is the best example. Now, I'm not agreeing with this, but that was their interpretation of Cotton Tom. After all, if you're a factory owner and you don't have to pay the people who work for you, why would you? Especially when you had a friend in Cotton Tom. The chief Communist Party organizer out of Birmingham, James S. Allen, wrote in his memoirs that he was not directly involved with the Tallapoosa uprising of 31 and 32, but knew that his party had been sending organizers to the local area and that several members of their Birmingham office had actually come from tenant farmer families in eastern Alabama. And he claimed that after 32, with many men dead, Reverend E.W. Ellis was basically run out of town because of the fact that he was railing against communism and the Reds and the Red Menace in the local community. And because he said that outside influence was going to turn them into a war zone, the sheriff started looking for Communist Party activists, and it all escalated from his attempt to find Mac Codes, a Chattanooga black activist. And after that, the false rumors were spread, which led to the lynching of Ralph Gray and a mob running amok through Camp Hill, which resulted, more likely than not, in many deaths, although those were never really reported. And he, I suppose, came back many years later because he was buried here in 1979, and the church that he was the reverend of is just over the hill here. I was speaking to an 86-year-old woman in the local county history museum, and she said many articles have been written about the fall of Camp Hill and why it became such a ghost town. And she said, I don't need to read any article to tell you the reason this town fell was Walmart. It ran out all of the smaller businesses, and now Camp Hill is not only a shell of what it once was, it's a ghost. Almost totally deserted and no industry.
Okay, guys, this is an update on rockets being fired from Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is right next to Israel.
And I believe I was told in the local history museum that this is the old schoolhouse. Such a beautiful building, and such a shame it's falling into disrepair like this.